The moment the Doolittle Raiders left Tokyo behind, relief was fleeting. Flying hundreds of miles over unfamiliar terrain, the men faced a stark reality. They had no fuel to return to their carrier. The USS Hornet was too far behind, beyond reach. Every mile closer to China was a test of endurance, nerve, and sheer willpower. Engines sputtered, weather turned harsh, and the constant threat of Japanese fighters loomed above. For many, hope was the only thing keeping them alive.
As the first planes approached China, disaster struck. Some bombers ran out of fuel before reaching their designated landing zones, forcing pilots to crash land in open fields or dense mountains. The ground was often unforgiving. Trees tore through wings, rocks shredded tires, and some men were thrown violently from their aircraft upon impact. Injuries were common. Broken bones, burns, and lacerations became badges of survival. In the midst of this chaos, a quiet heroism emerged. Pilots guided their crewmates to safety, mechanics offered first aid, and soldiers supported each other with words of encouragement. Each action a lifeline in the unforgiving wilderness. Chinese civilians played an extraordinary role in the aftermath. Villagers, aware of the danger posed by the advancing Japanese, hid the downed airmen in homes, barns, and caves. They offered food, medical care, and guidance through treacherous terrain. These acts of courage came at tremendous risk. Japanese forces often retaliated brutally against anyone found aiding Americans. Still, these civilians chose humanity over fear, risking everything to save men they had never met. Their courage became an inseparable part of the Doolittle Raid's story, a reminder that heroism is not confined to the battlefield. Not all airmen were so fortunate. 8 of the raiders were captured by Japanese forces, facing imprisonment, interrogation, and execution. The prisoners endured harsh conditions, malnutrition, and psychological torment. 3 of these men were executed, while others survived, bearing scars both physical and emotional. Their stories highlight the grim reality of war. Bravery does not guarantee safety, and sacrifice often comes at a staggering cost. Yet even in captivity, these men refused to break. They maintained their dignity, supported one another, and became symbols of resilience for their fellow servicemen. Back in the United States, the news of the raid had already begun to resonate. The Doolittle Raid was not just a military strike, it was a psychological blow to Japan and a morale booster for Americans. Citizens who had been living under the shadow of fear after Pearl Harbor now found a symbol of hope, daring, and national pride. Posters, newspapers, and radio broadcasts celebrated the mission, emphasizing the courage of ordinary men accomplishing the extraordinary. Children listened in awe, veterans nodded with pride, and the nation collectively exhaled, reassured that the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces were capable of audacious feats. The strategic impact of the Doolittle Raid extended beyond morale. Japan, humiliated by the unexpected attack on its capital, redirected resources and troops to homeland defense, weakening their positions elsewhere in the Pacific. This diversion indirectly aided American forces in subsequent campaigns, including the critical Battle of Midway. The raid proved that the Japanese homeland was not invulnerable, sowing seeds of doubt within their military leadership. A seemingly small operation had far-reaching consequences, underscoring the value of ingenuity, courage, and calculated risk. For Doolittle and his surviving men, the mission forged bonds that would last a lifetime. These men were ordinary in many ways, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, yet they had faced extraordinary circumstances. They carried memories of fiery skies, shattered aircraft, harrowing crashes, and the faces of those they lost along the way. They remembered the villagers who risked everything to help them, and the comrades who had given their lives in service of a daring plan. The emotional weight of these experiences never fully lifted, but it became a source of quiet pride, a testament to what can be achieved when courage meets purpose. In the decades that followed, the legacy of the Doolittle Raid continued to grow. Monuments were erected, medals awarded, and stories told and retold. James Doolittle himself remained humble, often deflecting praise to the men who flew the planes, the crews who maintained them, and the civilians who aided them. Yet history remembers him as a symbol of leadership under pressure, a man who orchestrated one of the boldest missions of the war with precision, vision, and heart. The human element of the Doolittle Raid remains its most enduring lesson. It reminds us that behind every operation, every strategic maneuver, and every historical headline, there are human beings facing impossible odds, making split-second decisions, and choosing courage over fear. It is a story that transcends time, speaking not only to Americans, but to anyone who has ever confronted uncertainty and dared to act despite it. As the sun set over the Pacific in those critical days of April 1942, 16 bombers changed history. Lives were lost, lives were saved, and the courage of a few inspired a nation. From the cramped cockpits of B-25s to the hidden villages of China, from the decks of the Hornet to the corridors of American homes listening to radio broadcasts, the Doolittle Raid became more than a mission. It became a symbol that even in the darkest hours, boldness, skill, and the human spirit could strike back against overwhelming odds. Today, when we remember the Doolittle Raiders, we remember more than a bombing run over Tokyo. We remember the men who risked everything, the civilians who acted with selfless bravery, and the enduring message that courage, when united with purpose, can change the course of history. The Doolittle Raid stands as a chapter in history where ordinary men achieved the extraordinary, where hope was restored in the face of fear, and where America's spirit of courage shone brighter than ever. It reminds us that in war, as in life, the measure of greatness is not only in victory, but in the willingness to risk everything for a cause larger than oneself.
It was April 1942, and the United States was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The attack had left the Pacific Fleet wounded, the nation shaken, and morale at a dangerously low point. Fear lingered in every harbor, every military base, and every American heart. In the months following the attack, the Japanese seemed unstoppable, their fleet dominating the vast Pacific with an arrogance that only made the pain of defeat more acute. But in Washington, a spark of daring began to ignite. The military brass knew that the United States needed a symbol, something bold enough to strike at the heart of Japan itself, to show both the enemy and the American people that the U.S. was far from defeated. That spark came to life in the form of a plan so audacious that many considered it impossible: to launch bombers from an aircraft carrier and strike the Japanese homeland, hitting Tokyo itself. Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a seasoned pilot and innovator, was chosen to lead the mission. Doolittle was known for his cool demeanor and fearless approach to aviation, but even he recognized the enormous risk of what lay ahead. He would be taking 16 B-25 bombers, planes designed for land-based operations, and launching them from the deck of the USS Hornet, a feat never attempted before. If anything went wrong, there would be no second chances. The aircraft had to be light, fast, and precise. The men, hand-picked for skill and nerve, had to be ready to face almost certain danger. Training for the mission was intense and relentless. The crews practiced short takeoffs on airstrips, simulating the impossible constraints of a carrier deck. Mechanics worked tirelessly, stripping unnecessary weight from the bombers, fine-tuning engines, and ensuring every instrument, every bolt, every propeller could withstand the rigors of the Pacific. The men knew the stakes, but there was also a shared sense of pride, a collective determination that bound them together. They were not just soldiers, they were pioneers on the edge of history. On April 1st, the Hornet left San Francisco Bay, sailing quietly into the vast Pacific under the cover of darkness. The men of the Doolittle Raid knew that secrecy was paramount. If the Japanese learned of their mission, it would be a death sentence, not just for the crew, but potentially for civilians who might come to their aid. As the carrier sliced through the waves, the sailors on deck and the airmen below worked with a tense energy, aware that the next few days could change everything or end everything. April 18th arrived with a tension that could almost be felt in the air. Early in the morning, the Hornet was detected by a Japanese patrol. The element of surprise had been compromised. Doolittle knew that the launch would have to happen earlier than planned. There was no time to hesitate. Orders were given. The 16 B-25 bombers, engines roaring, rolled down the deck, their wheels skimming just inches above the steel, propellers churning the salty air. Hearts pounded not just in the cockpit, but across the deck as sailors gripped railings, watching their comrades fly into danger. The takeoff was miraculous. Against all odds, the planes lifted off into the sky, climbing toward the horizon, leaving the carrier behind. For the men aboard the Hornet, there was relief and fear mingled together. They had sent their friends into the unknown, across hundreds of miles of open ocean, toward an enemy homeland prepared to shoot them down. And yet, there was awe at the courage it took to do so, knowing the impossible had just been achieved. The journey to Tokyo was tense and silent in its own way. The crews flew low over the Pacific, navigating with precision to avoid enemy radar and fighter planes. There was little room for error. One mistake could mean capture or death. The men were aware that this was more than a bombing mission. It was a test of endurance, skill, and nerve. They carried not just bombs, but the hopes of a wounded nation. When the bombers reached their targets, Tokyo appeared below them, a sprawling city still glowing with the morning light. The crews followed their training to the letter, releasing their payloads over military installations, factories, and supply depots. Explosions shattered the calm, smoke rising into the sky, while the men of the Doolittle Raid raced away from the city, heartbeats hammering, knowing that retaliation would be swift. The raid itself was over in minutes, but the danger had only begun. The bombers had no fuel to return to the Hornet, which was hundreds of miles behind them. Doolittle had planned for the men to land in China, but the journey there was fraught with peril. Japanese fighters scoured the skies, radar tracked their every move, and weather conditions made navigation difficult. Each mile felt like an eternity, each passing second a reminder that survival was uncertain. By the time the first bombers reached China, exhaustion, fear, and relief mingled in equal measure. Some crash-landed in open fields, engines failing, wings clipped by trees or mountains. Others found small airstrips where they could set down with care. Every landing was a miracle, but not without consequence. Injuries, burns, and broken bones were common, and every survivor carried the weight of what had happened and the knowledge that not all of their comrades would make it. The human cost was immediate. Some crews were captured by Japanese forces, becoming prisoners of war under harsh conditions. Others were aided by Chinese villagers who risked their lives to shelter and care for the Americans. These acts of bravery, often unsung, became a vital part of the story. Proof that heroism existed not just in the skies, but on the ground, in the hearts of ordinary people who chose courage over fear. Back in the United States, the news of the raid spread quickly. Americans who had been living under the shadow of Pearl Harbor felt a surge of pride and hope. A small group of men had done the impossible. They had struck the Japanese mainland and returned, in part, to tell the tale. The psychological impact on both sides of the war was profound. For the Japanese, it was a wake-up call, a sudden realization that their homeland was not untouchable. For Americans, it was a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the willingness to risk everything for the greater good. Doolittle himself remained humble. He understood the risks, the luck, and the courage that had made the mission possible. He never saw it as a personal triumph, but as the collective achievement of the men under his command, the mechanics who prepared the planes, the sailors who kept the Hornet operational, and the civilians who offered aid along the way. It was a story of collaboration, sacrifice, and sheer daring, a story that would inspire generations to come.